be available to you after the end of the session. If you have to miss any portion of the presentation, you will receive the link to the recording later this evening. If you miss any of the 4 sessions and you'd like to make it up, the recording will be your way of watching the pre-recorded session and then taking a 10-question multiple choice quiz to be marked as complete for that particular session. Um, as you probably know, you're about 75% of the way through the program right now. The final session will be on December 3rd. Um, I wanted to welcome everybody to this portion, which is entitled City Regulations and Design Guidelines. My name is John Haber. I'm the Field Services Director for the California Preservation Foundation. The California Preservation Foundation is a membership-based, not-for-profit organization whose mission is to provide statewide leadership in education and advocacy to ensure protection of historic resources in California. I wanted to personally thank each of you for supporting our organization through your registration for this program. I also want to congratulate you on making it this far and expressing your interest in marketing and selling historic properties. The knowledge you gain in this program will not only serve your clients well, but it will also ensure the protection of our state's rare cultural heritage. With your registration, you receive one annual membership to our organization, which entitles you to over 20 other webinars and a dozen on-site workshops throughout the state. We hope you will use that opportunity to become an advocate for historic preservation in your community. Today's session will look at more design guidelines and regulations in various cities in the Bay Area. Each speaker will cover how the regulations and design guidelines in their city compares and contrasts with other cities. The session features 4 speakers presenting together for a little over an hour in length. We will close with a 15-minute question and answer period. A few quick notes. There is a chat box on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. Everything that is typed in the chat box will appear to everybody in the room. If you would like to comment or interject, or if you have technical problems, you may do so through the chat box. If you are connected to a mobile device using the Adobe Connect mobile app, certain interactive features may not be available to you, but you should still be able to watch and listen to the presentation. If you are attached to a microphone, you should grant Adobe Connect voice access to your microphone when asked to do so. Your voice will be muted during most of the presentation, but you may raise your hand by clicking on the hand symbol at the top of your screen. Once your hand is raised, we will grant you voice access at an appropriate time in the presentation. This will allow you to have a short dialogue with the speakers or ask a question in person. If for some reason your sound does not work, you will need to type in your question or response in the chat box. I am now going to introduce each of the 4 speakers today. Danielle Stoudy has worked with the City of Mill Valley for over 8 years as a senior planner. Danielle mainly works on advanced planning work, which involves consensus building on the development of large policy-level projects such as the Miller Avenue Streetscape Plan and the recently adopted General Plan. Kathleen Kilgariff has assisted the City of Mill Valley as an associate planning intern for approximately 2 years after finishing school at the University of Oregon, where she studied urban planning, policy, and Spanish. She works with architects, developers, and residents on a daily basis at the planning counter and has in-depth knowledge of the city's planning and building redevelopment process and requirements. Alan Tai, AICP, is Planning Services Manager for the City of Alameda. He has over 12 years of experience in development review. In his current role, he oversees the Permit Center and Design Review process, and he serves as the Secretary to the city's Historical Advisory Board. Alan previously worked at the City of San Jose in a variety of planning positions. He also served on the American Planning Association Northern California Board from 2008 to 2012. Alan holds a master's degree in planning from San Jose State University and a bachelor's degree from the University of Southern California. Sally Zarnowitz, lead AP, has been a licensed architect for over 20 years, specializing in sustainable urban infill adaptive reuse projects and managing historic preservation, urban planning, and architectural design and incentive programs. She is the Senior Historic Preservation Planner for the City of Berkeley, serving as the Secretary to the Landmarks Preservation Commission, and overseeing the survey, designation, and design review of historical resources. Ms. Zarnowitz has focused her work in the public sector, where she has developed and facilitated creative designs and policies, as well as environmental and regulatory solutions for historical resource conservation. Prior to coming to the city of Berkeley, she served as the Historic Preservation Officer for the city of San Jose and practiced architecture in the San Francisco Bay Area and New York City, joining the College of San Mateo Department of Architecture faculty in 1991. Ms. Zarnowitz received her master's in architecture from the Harvard Graduate School of Design and her bachelor's in history from the University of California at Berkeley. She has resided in San Jose, California since 1993 with her husband and 2 sons. So without further ado, at this point, I'm going to briefly mute all the attendees in the room right now and follow that up with turning it over to Sally Zarnowitz. Thank you. Okay, Sally, you are ready to go.
Okay, thank you, John. This is Sally. I think we need to shorten my introduction a little bit. But that was great, and thanks for everybody for being here today. This first slide introduces our topic, city regulations and design guidelines, with some what we call thought-provoking images in some urban settings of maybe older buildings and newer projects. And then this is an overview of, I think, our presentation today. So I'm doing this first part, which is reviewing historic preservation and design review. What's the background of the regulatory framework for that? Touching on the Secretary of the Interior standards, which are National Park Service standards, federally adopted standards for treating historic properties. And then also, I think our last slide when I'm talking is we're all going to chime in about our various boards and commissions and how they work in our various jurisdictions. And then the next part would be the design review process, and Alan and Danielle, Kathleen would be talking about those processes in Alameda and in Mill Valley. And I think Alan's also going to then talk on common applications and useful tips. So that's the outline of the way we're going to break down the presentation today. And we start with the police power, which is spelled out here as the fundamental power vested in every state. It's really to regulate the exercise of private rights. And I think the point often made with the police power is that the courts have upheld it in a very broad sense relating to general welfare of the community and what that means. So where building codes would be just ministerial, and I kind of jumping down to those later bullet points, planning and zoning, land use would be discretionary, and that would come under the welfare. So it's not just the public health and safety, but also their general welfare. It's a pretty broad scope. And under that police power comes community planning, and listed here zoning and preservation ordinances, subdivisions, sign controls. And I think we've noted in the past that some governments have exercised this power actually to do other things, to prohibit the sale of liquor and cigarettes and gambling, prohibited the making of bricks in a town, the maintenance of livery stables, public laundries, etc. So this has had a kind of a broad brush over the years. But that is where the basic community planning and design review preservation, where cities, local jurisdictions have the authority to create these regulations and to exercise them. And then this slide is about historic preservation and design review, just kind of talking about these two entities and how they relate a little bit. Historic preservation is really to coordinate and support the public efforts to, we really talk about historic resources, identifying them and then evaluating them, so determining how significant they are. And then when we say protect, that's more of the design, where the design review for the resources come in. So preserving them and allowing for changes while doing that. And then design review is a program to conserve. It's really looking at maintaining the character of an area, the value of property, which preservation does as well. And it's looking more, it's looking at buildings that are compatible and harmonious. It's really discouraging construction of buildings that would be jarring. And I don't know, maybe you could think back to that. We could kind of go back to that first fun slide to think about, things that might be a little bit jarring. I want to just go back 1 second and note that, historic preservation, also the regulations there we have got in 1966, there was a National Historic Preservation Act, and so, that's kind of where a lot of fundamental regulations began related to historic preservation. So this is really just talking about a couple of universal truths about design guidelines. That it's really important to note that the design guidelines by themselves certainly do not guarantee good design, but that they are underlying elements that any design guideline document should convey in order to be useful would be these things, being consistent, predictability, and flexibility. In terms of being consistent, the guidelines would need to be fair and have the ability to be fairly applied. And they shouldn't be arbitrary, and they shouldn't certainly appear to be arbitrary. In terms of being predictable, they need to make sense. They need to be clear and focused and but they allow us to share a common language about design. And over time, they can certainly be amended, changed, built on to reflect the importance of a certain area or a neighborhood. And then in terms of being flexible, they really shouldn't be so prescriptive as to have a very limited shelf life. And their use is discretionary. Going back to that earlier slide where I was talking about discretion versus what we call ministerial. So something ministerial, you could think of it as something that has less discretion, more just has to be approved. Like typically a building permit, not in all cities, but in most. Building permit would be ministerial. Their use, the guidelines, the use of them is discretionary, and that's partly because they're applied on a case-by-case basis in all kinds of different, under the particular circumstances of the case or the property that is being reviewed. And then these, again, are just based on the goals that we just talked about. This slide really, I think, is meant to explain itself. It's saying that most of us could agree that these all sound like good things for us to aspire to: quality, human scale, pedestrian safety, and really architectural integrity. These are all things that we're looking for in communities. So the guidelines are meant to be a balance of these shared values for the built environment. And that's kind of their intent. And this slide is talking about the application of the guidelines and really building down from the umbrella document or from the less specific down to the more specific. So the baseline design requirements would be applied to, say, all residences within a city. And then special zoning districts or planned development zoning districts would have particular design regulations just for a neighborhood or a particular development. Historic districts would have design guidelines that would apply, again, to that entire district with more generalized guidelines. And then historic landmarks, of course, you'd be looking at just the specifics of that very important individual property. So I think what we're looking at a lot today are historic districts and historic landmarks. Those would be typical types of historic resources, historic properties that you would be dealing with. And this is also an overview or just, again, a framework of city policies and guidelines. The general plan being the umbrella document for the city, what we call the blueprint for the city. It's the highest level visionary policy, sense from architects as well, that new construction, new additions should be of their time to some extent, or to a large extent. But the next one is about preserving changes that may have occurred over time, and say they were built in 1950 in addition to a 1920 home, and now that addition has its own character and should be considered in preserving the property. That's kind of what number 4 is about. Materials and constructions look specifically at trying to pay attention to how the building is put together, the house. Repair is preferable to replacing things like windows, doors. 7, this standard is talking about chemical and physical treatments. calling for them to be as gentle as possible. In other words, not sandblasting brick so that all the surface of it is really destroyed. This is 8 is about archaeological resources, so it's really looking at, again, things below the ground and preserving important walls or human remains or anything that would be under the ground that would be significant, and typically not as relevant to a single-family house, but it is in the standards and is important. And then these next 2 are very much, I think you'll see a lot of slides where I talk about these, because new features need to be harmonious, and they also, and then reversible. That's not, I guess the issues that I really tend to look at, and I think you'll see a lot of examples here today, would be that the new work would want to be harmonious, but it also can be differentiated, which is where we go back up to that, not creating a false sense of history, number 3. So these later standards, which are about additions, deal with those 2 issues. How is the new work harmonious? How is it slightly different from the old so that it can kind of tell that story that it evolved over time? And this example came from the San Francisco workshop, which was really specific to that city. But looking at plans and policies, this is an example of one neighborhood, the Casho neighborhood. And here's the umbrella document, the general plan. So there's the urban design element and the housing element. Both of them talk about taking care and remodeling older buildings and allowing growth, I think that's probably an important point to make, is that regulations and certainly general plans acknowledge that there's a need for housing in California cities. And how can we do that, but also maintain the character of a residential neighborhood? Regarding design review, or regarding this plan in particular, they're looking at using the Secretary of the Interior standards in the design guidelines, and how would a new addition be subordinate to the historic building, which is really one of the key things, that it shouldn't overwhelm it. It should not compete in size, scale, or design. And they're asking the questions, why is the property significant? In other words, here the architecture makes it very significant, and what are all the features that you would want to preserve, and how does the project respect those? And part of the issue with that is, of course, what's visible of the new addition. And that, in this sense, it's a big part of it, because there's a deep lot and the house is at the front. And again, here's where we talk about the planning code, the zoning, which would allow for a certain size envelope, a certain height, and certain setbacks. But then the question would be also, how does that design respect the character of the original house? And we can see here that the bulk of this addition is at the rear. So here this house has grown considerably, but maintained its overall character at the street. So in an urban setting, putting the addition at the back, it's a really great solution. These guidelines also talk about a partial third-story setback, and how would an addition on top of this building, there you can see the little sketch to the left here. I guess I can point my arrow. So on this subject building where they put a third story on, the guidelines are talking, thank you. The guidelines are talking about stepping back on that third story and making a transition up to the third story there. So again, making a rooftop addition compatible. And I think I have an example of this also in Berkeley. So this was, again, an older neighborhood, and this second story addition is set back considerably. Let's see if I can, there I go. Yeah, it's set back considerably behind the parapet of the first floor, so that you can. And here's the umbrella document, the general plan. So there's the urban design element and the housing element. Both of them talk about taking care and remodeling older buildings and allowing growth, I think that's probably an important point to make, is that regulations and certainly general plans acknowledge that there's a need for housing in California cities. And how can we do that, but also maintain the character of a residential neighborhood? regarding design review or regarding this plan in particular, they're looking at using the Secretary of the Interior standards in the design guidelines, and how would a new addition be subordinate to the historic building, which is really one of the key things, that it shouldn't overwhelm it. It should not compete in size, scale, or design. And they're asking the questions, why is the property significant? In other words, you know, here the architecture makes it very significant, and what are all the features that you would want to preserve, and how does the project respect those? And part of the issue with that is, of course, what's visible of the new addition. And that, in this sense, it's a big part of it because there's a deep lot and the house is at the front. And again, here's where we talk about the planning code, the zoning, which would allow for a certain size envelope, a certain height, and certain setbacks. But then the question would be also, how does that design respect the character of the original house? And we can see here that the bulk of this addition is at the rear. So here this house has grown considerably, but maintained its overall character at the street. So in an urban setting, putting the addition at the back, it's a really great solution. These guidelines also talk about a partial third-story setback, and how would an addition on top of this building, there you can see the little sketch to the left here. I guess I can point my arrow. So on this subject building where they put a third story on, the guidelines are talking, yeah, thank you. The guidelines are talking about stepping back on that third story and making a transition up to the third story there. So again, making a rooftop addition compatible. And I think I have an example of this also in Berkeley. So this was, again, an older neighborhood, and this second story addition is set back considerably. Let's see if I can, there I go. Yeah. It's set back considerably behind the parapet of the first floor, so that you know, you can differentiate it and also keep the overall massing and character of the street, the house at the street. And I think, as you'll see again and again here, the idea is that houses can adopt and change, but they need to be respected as that is happening. And this is an example from San Jose, the Palm Haven neighborhood, which is like a historic preservation overlay. And in this case, there's an example of pre-design guidelines and post-design guidelines. So on the left, you can see pre-design guidelines. And in this case, this is an older home. You really can't recognize much of that home anymore. The garage was added. The second story was kind of put right on top of it. But as we move over to the post-design guidelines, the detached garage is maintained. The whole first floor is maintained, and then the second story matches the roof shape and is set back considerably. So these are the ideas that the guidelines are regulating. And again, they're not, in this case, they're allowing quite a bit of new space in that addition, but trying to do it in a way that maintains the character. And I think this is a good reminder, this slide, that the standards are a tool to preserve historic buildings and recognize unique historic character, really to maintain or retain the character of a neighborhood. They're used in, again, planning review, environmental review, and they provide a consistent framework. But they are not a tool to dictate style. They don't regulate new or historic uses. I know we talked about uses in the standards, but that's more of an issue of how to maintain a use that's helpful to the building. But they do not regulate uses, and they're not really a tool, or not intended to be a tool, to limit growth or regulate density. So they're really looking at the character of the building or the place. And I think we were all going, this is my last slide, I think we're all going to chime in here a little bit about how these different boards and commissions work in our different cities. It's looking at the idea here of an action body versus an advisory body. And again, some permits, as we talked about, permits that are ministerial that could go straight to a building permit, others that would need to go through some kind of design review, others that would need a zoning permit, and possibly in some cities a historic preservation permit, something that goes through the Landmarks Commission. So I don't know if I'm going to hand this over to Alan and Danielle to talk about Alameda and Mill Valley, but I don't know if you guys want to chime in on this slide relative to your particular jurisdictions.
No, I think you've covered everything. I'll cover stuff in the other slides. Speaking of, so a little bit about Mill Valley and our process that we've developed in association with the historic properties. Basically, all properties are screened for historic significance as part of design review and part of the CEQA process. Most recently, we have a historic, in 1975, we established a historic overlay zone. There's about 28 parcels associated with that, not a lot. We also have a partial list of structures that was conducted based on a survey done in 1998 by the Historic Society, and there's 100 parcels on that. So what we've done for the actual parcels haven't been done in a while, so that's why we tend to screen all our redevelopment projects for potentially historic significance. Most recently, let me go to the next slide. We adopted our general plan last year. In it, there are 2 programs that we'll be working on as part of implementing the general plan, probably in the 2015-2016 horizon. And you'll see Alan will have some slides on Alameda's process, and it's basically following the same process. They're a little farther in the process than we are, but we're following the same path of now identifying a more robust list and inventory of all the parcels, and basically developing an ordinance that really creates some regulations and process associated with historic preservation and cultural resources. It would include design guidelines, some standards and process for the overall review of historic properties. We also have an interest in looking at responsibilities for caring and maintaining existing historic properties. Even if there isn't any intention to rehabilitate, we would like to have general maintenance included and ongoing as part of that historic structure, and salvaging architectural elements of historic properties as well. So those are upcoming regulations we'll be working on. And in the meantime, basically as part of redevelopment, we use our zoning historic overlay, the partial list developed by the Historic Society, as well as just double checking based on the age of the structure, and visually going out and looking at the property as part of the design review. And let me see. Examples of historically zoned properties include some of these pictures. 64 level used to be the old library that is now a residence. And then the other two, I need to get a little more information on. I'm not sure of the historic significance of those two buildings. And then, Alan, I'll turn it back to you. And Alan, just quickly, Mill Valley is close to the same. Half of our housing stock is basically built before 1960, with about 30% at pre-World War, 1942.
And Berkeley would be similar to Alameda. Sorry. Berkeley, just saying Berkeley would be similar to Alameda. Thanks.
Yeah, sorry. Um, so basically, our design review process in Mill Valley, most of your redevelopment will require some sort of review by staff. Um, there is the ministerial review at building counter that was talked about earlier, that you can just get sign off. But even that, you're going to have a planner sign off as well as the building department sign off on requirements. Then you move on from there to a staff level, zoning administrator, planning commission, and city council. And as Alan was talking, there's advisory boards. These are all action boards. We don't really have any advisory boards that provides input, but actually not direction. So these are basically, there's 3 levels of review. The appeal process, basically, if we don't approve a sentence at the staff level, it can be appealed and brought to the zoning administrator and so on. So a planning commission review can then be appealed to city council for further review. So most of the redevelopment projects go to zoning administrator or planning commission. Zoning administrator does minor variances such as front setbacks for garages, and then additions that are around 35% of the existing floor area or 1,000 square feet. Once you get over, if you're doing a tear down or a new home, that's really something that will involve a planning commission, which is a 5-member board that will be reviewing your project. And we can go into questions and answers later if there's more questions that some of the participants might want to know about Mill Valley.
Alan, this is John. I'm not experiencing the delay, but it's often due to the bandwidth in your room, so it might take a little longer to load, but do you see it now? Oh, okay. Yeah, these are images of garages. If I could share my screen, I would, but they are
They're both recommended. It's slide 46.
yeah, that's the correct slide.
Great. Just one thing that we see a lot is starting work without permits, which Mill Valley actually just raised our fees in association with our code enforcement. So if you start work without the required planning or building permits, it will be 3 times the cost of the original fees. So really, I think that checklist is very important. Check with the city. We're here to help provide an opportunity to talk about, what you plan to do as well as the process and getting it done, and that's very important.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, each of you. And I'm going to mention that if there are any questions, you can either click on the raise hand symbol or type in your question. Preferably, just type your question into the chat box, and we'll address them here. Um, I think while we're waiting for questions to come in, something I may, I was curious about um, was what about infill development in districts? Say somebody buys a lot in a historic district and wants to build a house within a historic district. How does that process work?
This is Sally. I can take a stab at that. The design guidelines usually address that as well. I mean, they should address that as well. And the issues there are primarily, again, you'd be meeting the standards. You could use standards 9 and 10 for new construction. And that would be meeting the massing, being compatible, really in terms of massing and possibly materials with the district. And so a lot of zoning regulations, again, as long as your envelope is consistent with the zoning district and the design is somewhat compatible in terms of the massing, the setbacks, and also materials, that should be addressed. Again, that's that part where you want to be compatible, but you can be differentiated. So that first slide we could go back to, maybe that big tall building was a little tall, but its character might have been somewhat consistent with that area. So there's definitely more flexibility for new construction infill development.
And maybe to follow up on that, what is the difference between an overlay zone and a historic district?
I don't know if Danielle wants to address that. There's lots of different kinds. We kind of addressed zoning, I think, and then there's lots of different kinds of, if you will, historic areas. So there can be, sometimes they're called conservation areas. I think Danielle can address this in Mill Valley, but typically the historic district is something that actually was designated as a historic district. And then an overlay zone would be something that could be considered historic, but it's really also hooked into the zoning. But I'll let Danielle answer as well.
So our overlay is interesting. It's not a district. The overlay is related to specific parcels all over the city. There was a map in the presentation. So it's basically by parcel. So you would be following the, there's the zone property. So they're all over. It's not really a district. It's more based on parcel, and you would use the interior guidelines as part of your development standards and guidelines that you're using to redevelop the property.
Great. And I don't see any questions actually. This is the first time I think this has happened. But we'll wait a minute here just to see. We still have a few minutes, so I just wanted to make sure that everybody had a chance. And if not, then I have the contact information for each of the speakers, and if any of these speakers aren't in your city or cities that you work in, I could probably put you in touch with somebody who can answer your questions. As was mentioned, most planning departments have open counter uh, time slots, and I know that a lot of realtors and buyers um, have frequently made use of them. So maybe quickly, each of you could mention when your um, hours are for those.
You,
Uh, yeah.
Okay.
Mill Valley is Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, 8 to 12, 1 to 5. Wednesdays, um, afternoon, so 3 to 5. And then we're closed every other Friday. So, and that's the planning counter. The building counter has more specific hours, and those can be found on. I encourage any realtors working in Mill Valley to go to our website because there's detailed information and it's kept up to date. There's a lot of schedule changes or training, so the website's the best way to look at the planning hours, or building hours, sorry.
and this is Sally. That would be true in Berkeley also. I'd really look at the Permit Service Center. Those all the permits. It's on the first floor. And their phone number, 981-7500, area code 510. But planning, generally, the counter is 9 to 4. We're also, certain hours we're closed the third Friday or the second Friday of the month also. So we have that. But generally 9 to 4, I would say, and then just check our website.
Okay, so it appears there are no questions. Somebody even mentioned it was a thorough presentation, so I guess everybody did a great job. So thank you again to each of our speakers. I will close the session by asking everybody to please fill out the feedback form, which you've seen twice before now if you've been to every live session. Um, it does help us improve our programs, and we're planning on continuing this program in the future, so it will help us make our future programs better. And also, if you'd like any specific topics to be covered in future sessions, um, go ahead and type those into the response box, one of the two response boxes below. Um, I apologize. The web links box is empty at this moment, but when I send you the email this evening with the recording and the PDF of the presentation, you will receive as well a list of links to each of the planning departments and a few other resources. Um, so since there were no questions, it looks like we're going to begin or end a bit early here. I'll leave this screen up right now in case anybody needs to spend some time making their responses. And I wanted to remind everybody that the final of the 4 sessions will be on December 3rd, which will cover financial incentives and sustainability. It'll be at 2:30 p.m. once again. Um, and I will send out the link either the day before or the day of the presentation so that you receive a reminder on how to log